I bought my Craftsman Model 113 table saw brand new like 20 plus years ago directly from Sears. It was actually the first major tool purchase I had made up to that point. And when the saw was still on top of the flimsy metal stand that it came with, I vaguely remember there was a sticker on it that said 1.5 horsepower, peak 3 horsepower. And at the time, I never thought to question that. Although this saw has served me well, I had increasingly grown suspicious about the horsepower rating, given that on full blade height cuts, such as splitting a 2x4, the saw always bogged down. Occasionally the blade would stall, and I would end up usually tripping the breaker. Cutting thick maple was similarly a struggle, and a recent project I've been working on called for cutting a lot of maple. Perhaps naively, I had never bothered to check the motor sticker because it was oriented on the inside of the saw, and I didn't want to disassemble stuff to get to it. Working on the assumption that 1.5 horsepower was simply not enough power, I had purchased a 3 horsepower 220 volt motor with the intention to change it out immediately, and then immediately sat it in the floor of my garage for the next several years. The first step was to get the motor free of the mount, a task which proved somewhat tedious because of the limited room provided by this custom stand I had built several years ago when the original metal stand finally bit the dust. With a bit of futzing around, I got the motor free and finally got a good look at the nameplate. The horsepower rating was completely blank, go figure, but the motor listed the current draw at 13 amps at 120 volts, which equates to something around 3/4 of a horsepower to 1 horsepower, which is far from the 1.5 or peak 3 horsepower that the Craftsman marketing wanks had rated it. There was now no doubt in my mind that the anemic motor was the cause of many of my cutting problems. I'd picked up a new Leeson motor at an industrial yard sale that was rated at a full 3 horsepower at 220 volts, and it had similar rotation speed, it was continuous duty, and it ended up having a compatible mounting plate as well. I actually got pretty lucky with the mounting plate. I had bought this motor blind without having first measured the mounting plate on the saw, and instead relying on my memory of what it looked like. As I said, I got lucky. The model number for this particular motor is M6C34DB13 if you're interested in something similar. I had some leftover 12-3 cable from a different project that I ended up using to wire the motor to the switch. I really only needed 12-2, so I just capped off the unused conductor. For the new line cord, I picked up some 12-2 600-volt rubber sheathed cable from Home Depot. It's a similar cable to what I've used on both my planer and my jointer. The new motor was somewhat larger than the original, so it took a bit of dinking around to get it to fit the cabinet. If you end up doing a similar conversion and your saw is stand mounted, you'll have a much easier time of it. The original Craftsman belt guard wouldn't fit the new motor, so I just removed it. Looking at the original Craftsman power switch, it was rated for 250 volts at 15 amps, so it'll work fine for this motor. Wiring up the motor was pretty straightforward, although I wasn't crazy about these spade terminals. I ended up using them anyway, but I reinforced the connections with some shrink wrap after plugging them in. I tend to think power connections should be ring terminals rather than spades. There was just barely enough room to get both of these thick cables into the switch box. If I had to go back and do it again, I think I would probably opt for a smaller gauge wire from the motor to the switch, just to give myself a little bit more room. The new plug was a Leviton model that I've used with good success on two of my other machines, including the Parks planer that I recently restored. It's very heavy duty and real solid once it gets put together. To my delight, the motor spun up just fine on first start. It sounds like an absolute monster running. It's quite a bit louder than the old motor. The new motor, not only was it considerably easier to push the material through the blade, but the cut quality improved noticeably. The motor never even grunted. This is a piece of maple that I had cut immediately before doing this motor swap. It's a tick over 5/4 of an inch thick. There was quite a bit of burning because the saw struggled to do this cut on the old probably 3/4 horsepower motor. If you've got one of these saws, I can highly recommend doing a similar motor upgrade.